1, 2, 3, 4.
Hi, and welcome to the Vininspo podcast with me, Ed Merrison. This is where wine is a travel experience. Join us as we pick up bits and pieces, make new friends, and create memories that make our future interactions with wine, people, and places all the more meaningful and fun. On this week's podcast is Jason Lett, owner and vigneron at the Eyre Vineyards in Oregon's Dundee Hills. The estate was founded in 1965 by Jason's father David Lett, who, with his wife Diana, kicked off the modern era of wine growing in the Willamette Valley. Jason and I spoke about Papa Pinot's first flood-hit foray into Willamette wine growing, beating the Burgundians back-to-back in away fixtures and then welcoming them onto home turf, how to navigate the Beaver State, the accuracy of aircraft cable and Ted Worth's words of wisdom, effacing the ego of the winemaker, how unskilled labour is an insulting misnomer for a faithful, precious workforce, learning to love the Swiss miss who snuck in among the muscat, how cynicism and intent yield radically different results, miraculous mycorrhiza and the mystery of minerality, why the sweet spot of great wine growing lies on the precarious margins of possibility, what the fertile field of desert ecology teaches you about reading vines, the vichyssoise versus sashimi schools of Pinot Noir, and how wine can be a bulwark against the bullies. I started by asking Jason what life had been like as a little Lettlet.
Young Jason was always sort of left to his own devices to entertain himself, so I read a lot. And my career goals were to be an archaeologist, a writer, or an inventor. And I didn't realize it, but in my backyard was a profession that combined all of those things. So that's probably why I wound up where I am now.
And there was a time, wasn't there, where you did have a crack at the writing. What form did that take and how far did that go?
I started my college career as a creative writing major and then realized this is not something you can learn. It's just something you have to practice. So I actually wound up leaving school and going off and getting a job at a wildlife refuge, more for the purpose of being remote in a beautiful place and working on my writing. And what I found out there was that I really love biology, plants and botany specifically. So that's sort of what led me to change my path.
Well, we'll come on to that side of things later when we talk about farming. But your upbringing really is inseparable from the farm in many ways. So I think best to start with how the Lett family came to be where you are in the Willamette Valley and what the very beginnings of that process were.
The very beginnings precede me by 4 years when my father came to the Willamette Valley in 1965. And he had sort of made a bold choice. First of all, to be a winemaker at all, this is a time in the United States when that was not a professional path that anyone recognized. His graduating class at the University of California, Davis in 1964 was 6 people, and that was the undergraduates and graduate classes combined. So this was a very niche profession to undertake. But Dad had been really struck by, I think, the integrity of the profession. And he had met a winemaker in California named Lee Stewart, who was really operating at the very highest levels of the profession at a time when most of the wine in the United States was like sweet wine made in a facility that looked like an oil refinery. So Dad was definitely of the time that was really bucking that trend towards these blended sweet wines and really looking towards Europe and wines of place and expression. So when he graduated, he went to Europe for 8 months and traveled around and asked questions and worked and sort of immersed himself in wine culture all through Northern Europe and really particularly refined his love for Pinot Noir. He had been introduced to Pinot Noir at UC Davis. You know, his little group of 6 people had a tasting group and they would buy bottles of wine, and he was always struck by how Pinot Noir reflected the climates that it was grown in so well. That Pinot Noir from Napa, which is where it was grown in California at that time, was just a little overcooked. Whereas, these wines from Burgundy were a completely transformative animal. And so he wanted to find out more. One of his viticulture professors actually said there's few climates in California that are cool enough to grow Pinot Noir. So that and the travels in Europe really cemented Dad's idea that if he wanted to grow Pinot Noir, and that's absolutely what he wanted to do, he would have to find a climate that was perfect for it. And really, once you start looking around the world, and he had access to the UC Davis library, which, was full of amazing research worldwide, Once you start looking around the world, there's very few climates that are appropriate for Pinot Noir. New Zealand, where you are, in Australia, although Dad didn't know about that then. The northern coast of Portugal in the Minho Valley, which is cooled by the Atlantic. And really, the place that he kept circling back to was the Willamette Valley. It just seemed to have everything in terms of the appropriate climate. He didn't know much about the soils here, although he did have the U.S. Geological Survey sort of maps to look at and get broad ideas, but he really had to be here to find the right soils. So he came in the very early spring of 1965. He came in January, and sight unseen, with 3,000 grape cuttings that he had gathered from the University of California, Davis, and also, one selection of Chardonnay from a friend. And with this great confidence and knowledge that he was in the right place climatically, but then it was time to figure out, microclimate and soil.
You do so much more than just Pinot Noir these days, but I'm quite interested because he was already a philosophy graduate when he was doing his search. So I just wonder, and it's just conjecture really, but Pinot is the grape perhaps that most people philosophize about in the world of wine. Do you think that that's what drew him to the grape? But also, was going to Europe something that changed his mind about what his mission was? UC Davis was obviously doing amazing research of its own, but were there more people in the wine industry there focused inwards rather than outwards in that way?
It's interesting. I think that particular class was very much focused outwards, beyond the U.S. borders. His classmate, Charles Coury, actually studied in Alsace, went to the great winemaking school at Geisenheim. Bill Fuller was definitely very intrigued by Pinot Noir in cooler climates. And so I said that graduating class was 6 people. 3 of them wound up moving to Oregon to grow Pinot Noir. So there was definitely an allure to the grape and to the place that drew all 3 of them here.
And what was in Oregon, and more specifically the Willamette Valley when he arrived then? What was the precedent of fruit or grape growing there?
Well, the Willamette Valley still grows something like 250 crops. It's incredibly rich farmland as a result of glacial flooding, bringing soils here, and the fact that we're close to the Pacific and it's a fairly mediated climate. At that time, the big crops were walnuts, hazelnuts, cherries, prunes, wheat, a lot of small fruits like strawberries and blackberries and blueberries. Those are still big crops today. But in the early 1960s, a major windstorm decimated a lot of those orchards. And so the orchardists were sort of looking at their hillside sites, wondering what was going to happen, because the rich farmland was down on the valley floor. And these hillsides were considered marginal. At that time, actually, the state planning laws said, okay, you can build houses, but not on the rich farmland, but you can build it on the marginal farmland on the hillsides. Really, part of the Oregon story is about sort of defending this prime grapeland from development, for housing estates. When he came, there was this very diverse agriculture. Actually, when he came, had just been a devastating flood. And so he was driving on this elevated roadway, looking at miles and miles of water off on either side of him on the valley floor, wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake. And that first year was quite wet, and he had a really hard time actually planting the first vines. He couldn't drive a tractor in the field, so he had to hand dig the trenches that he planted those cuttings in.
Yeah, right. And how was he received by the locals? Did they welcome this crazy dream?
Bemused. I think bemused is the word. I'm looking over there to our old neighbors, the Werfs, wonderful family. And Ted Werfs used to come over and sit on a rock and watch my dad work and just very subtly lean in and said, if a person were to, and then offer this very insightful way to get the thing done that Dad was trying to do in a way that was much easier. So the farmers here were really intrigued by this young guy without a farming background, who was so fired up and who was really passionate about this crop that they'd never heard of, wine grapes. And I think they kind of saw it as a potential salvation. Certainly, when my dad and David Adelsheim and Bill Blosser went to the local county to make a case for grapes being a potentially valuable crop in the region and to protect these hillsides from housing developments, the county planners listened. Because here were these young farmers who clearly knew what they were doing and clearly educated and clearly enthusiastic. And as it turns out, they were right.
It's a theme that's come up a few times, and I'm sure it will again, the idea that things that come easy aren't necessarily good, and things that unfortunately come with rather more challenges can be more rewarding. But what is it about marginality that was so important to the choice of site and continues today and into the future?
That's a question that agronomists have been wrestling with for hundreds of years. And there is a theory that any fruit, doesn't matter whether it's a grape or a strawberry, ripens best when it's in a climate where it achieves ripeness right at the end of its potential growing season. So to maximize the amount of time that it has to gather flavor without those flavors and aromas getting boiled out by too much heat. And it depends. If you're Carignan, you obviously need a lot more heat to ripen than if you're Pinot Noir. And so this is a wildly inappropriate place to plant Carignan, but it's a perfect place to plant Pinot Noir. But it's interesting. This is what, kind of Dad took away from his travels in Europe. Like, no matter what region he would go to, whatever variety they were growing was on the bleeding edge of ripening completely before the weather closed down in the fall. People in Bordeaux could save themselves an enormous amount of trouble by planting Syrah, but they don't. Same in the Rhone. People in the Rhone could save themselves an enormous amount of trouble and pick in August if they just planted Pinot Noir, but they don't. And so Dad was really intrigued by this need to find a climate that would offer the grapes the maximum potential to ripen.
Yes, and although Pinot Noir was the focal point of the mission and obviously continues to be massively important to Eyrie, he was, of course, also interested in those other varieties in Bordeaux and did plant other varieties as much as anything else to observe how they behaved in the climate?
To some extent. He was very focused in his choices because he didn't have a lot of money and he didn't have a lot of room to make mistakes. He planted not Bordeaux varieties, but other varieties in that earliest ripening period. So kind of going back to the 19th century, there's a French agronomist named Victor Pouliot, and he published this amazing book called 1,000 Varieties of Vines, in which he assigns each of these 1,000 varieties the climactic zone in which it ripens the best, and he set up 5 zones. So the earliest ripening one is period 1. So when Dad came, he planted other period 1 varieties. So principally about 800 cuttings each of Chardonnay and Pinot Noir. So that was about a little bit more than half of what he brought. But then he brought 5 other varieties to make up the balance. Pinot Meunier, Melon de Bourgogne, Pinot Gris, Muscat, Hautenel, Gewürztraminer, and Riesling. It turns out that Gewürztraminer and Riesling were maybe a little too close to period 2 to ripen correctly in our climate back in the cold 70s. So we wound up grafting those over to Pinot Gris. But from those original 7, he came up with 5 really good performers, especially Pinot Gris, which had been unplanted in the United States, or we think really commercially outside of Europe, until Dad put those vines in. And now it's, Oregon's leading white wine.
Cool. I would love to talk about those wines specifically as they pertain to you and your experience now a bit later. But first of all, if you could give us the lie of the land across the state of Oregon as far as where grapes grow and why, dialing in from the state, closing in on the Willamette Valley, and then focusing on your particular pocket there in the Dundee Hills.
Yeah, absolutely. So Oregon is sort of a big square with 2 mountain ranges in it. So if we're looking at the square here and, this is the Pacific Ocean here, then we have the coast, the sandy beaches of Oregon, but then right behind them, the Coast Range, which is a low, old range of mountains. Over the top of the Coast Range, you fall into the Willamette Valley, and actually a whole series of valleys that go down the state from north to south, the Willamette, the Umpqua, and the Rogue. Then you cross another higher, much younger range of mountains called the Cascades. And once you cross the Cascades, you're in a wildly different climate. People think that Oregon, they associate it with moss and trees and things. The eastern side of the state is high desert. It's sagebrush and cows and cowboys, and it looks much more like Arizona than like a Pacific rainforest. So clearly, the best place for grapes is not over there where there's not enough water, where it gets radically cold in the winter. I lived out there for a while. It was negative 30 degrees in the winter. And then in the summer, in Celsius, it can get up well into the 40s. So clearly being a little closer to the ocean is good, but we can't be too close to the ocean because the Pacific, this far north, is very cold. And it forms a temperate rainforest over on the coast. The town of Tillamook, which is directly to the west of us here on the coast, receives 10 feet of rain a year, which is about 3 meters of rain. That's a significant amount and would absolutely drown a grapevine. So we're in sort of what we call the Goldilocks zone here in the Willamette Valley. So we're snuggled between these two ranges of mountains. The Coast Range prevents too much of that rain from coming over. It prevents too much of that cooling influence from the Pacific, unduly sort of, delaying ripening in the vines. So you can kind of look at the Willamette Valley like a triangle with the largest town in the state, Portland, here at the top. And then the second largest town, Eugene, here at the point. And so it's about 160 miles between the two. And so this zone within it has a variety of microclimates. When you get over here towards the east, too close to the mountains, those clouds coming from the Pacific are being lifted up over the mountains. And as they are, the rain is being wrung out of them. So this eastern side of the valley is actually quite cool and wet compared to the western side of the valley. So when Dad was looking around for a place to plant, he immediately kind of homed in on the fact that he had to be a little bit closer to the Coast Range than the Cascades just to avoid the rain. Then once he was there, it was sort of a question like, how far south do I go? The further south you go is anywhere, the warmer it gets. And so he eventually kind of wound up really centering his search in sort of the northwest quadrant of this triangle in the Willamette Valley.
Fantastic description, and very impressive that you can do the entire geography with hand gestures instead of maps. And so the estate itself, if you could just give us a bit of a timeline then of how your father's experience progressed from those early days of seeing the floods and planting in the wet through to the first signs of success/acclaim for what he was doing.
Well, really acclaim and success both took about 15 years, and they were a very long, hard 15 years. Really probably the best decision that my father ever made was to marry my mother. They married in 1966, and my mom had grown up on a farm and very much wanted to return to that. And within 12 weeks of meeting, actually, she found herself standing in a field with her wedding gift from my father on, which was a pair of flannel-lined rain gear, digging up these grape cuttings from their muddy trenches so that they could be moved to the present vineyard site in the Dundee Hills. So that was sort of like the biggest step, was actually establishing a vineyard. And Mom tells this funny story about laying out the rows and using a piece of wire that they had marked every 6 feet so that they could plant the vines at the right intervals. Unbeknownst to them, wire stretches. And so by the time they got to the bottom of the block, the vines were splayed out compared to where they should be. And she says that the marriage almost ended, a few weeks after starting because of that. But this is one of those cases when Ted Wirfs would lean over the fence and say, if a person were to use a piece of aircraft cable, that doesn't stretch. So we still have that piece of aircraft cable with all the tape on it in the barn. And when we have to lay out new vineyards, sometimes we break it out.
Right, sometimes the old technology is the best.
Exactly. So the first crop, because, Dad started from cuttings, and these are just like little dead pieces of stick, looking kind of like what I have in the flower arrangement behind me. You stick those in the ground, and the buds that are underground will grow roots, and the ones that are above ground will grow leaves. And so it required a year for them to get an established enough root system for him to be able to dig them up and then plant them successfully in this vineyard site, at the required spacings and everything. So they didn't have water. Everything had to be hand watered. So if things were looking warm, they would go out and hand water, and everything was hand hoed. My mom and dad worked so hard and so much physical labor to get these vines established. So by 1970, we finally had a crop on the vines that would warrant a harvest. In 1969, there was a little bit, the birds ate them all. So 1970, we had enough crop for 350 cases of wine. So that was really our first harvest. My parents gathered their friends together. We used old prune boxes and loaded them into the back of the pickup and ran them to the winery. And the winery was a completely, sort of improvised, production space with a hand crank crusher stemmer and an old press that Dad had inherited from a winery down in southern Oregon that had inherited it from a pioneer winery that had gone out of business. So we think this press maybe at this point is 150 years old. Anyway, so that was the first press, this big hydraulic press. The one thing that they didn't scrimp on was oak barrels. It was really hard to get French oak barrels in the United States in 1970. And fortunately, Dad had contacts with André Chelistjeff at Beaulieu, which was a California winery with, a really established reputation. Andre was, even in those days considered to be the godfather of quality wine production in America. So Andre and Dad went in together on a container of barrels from Burgundy. And that was our first cooperage. So we started with 30 brand new French oak barrels. And whenever my father would complain about too much new oak in wine, I would always remind them that his first vintage was 100% new oak. And things went along in those early years. It was really just sort of introducing people here in Oregon to the concept of Oregon wine. And, Pinot Noir and Pinot Gris, these were difficult things for people to wrap their minds around. At that time we were making wine in Oregon, but a lot of it was really sweet fruit wines, fortified fruit wines. So it was a real kind of struggle to identify customers for these wines. It was really sort of by word of mouth, really, that people kind of found out about us and would drive down from Portland and load cases of wine into their cars and drive back. I can remember my parents actually, scooping my brother and I up after school and driving up to Portland to go drop wine off at restaurants. Every single bottle was filled, corked, labeled, and sold by my folks directly for those first, 5 years.
There's something I find really interesting about this, and that is your father obviously had, friends like Charles Curry and friends at Davis and great professors and lots of research that had come from the past that was actually extremely relevant that had been brought into the light by researchers at Davis. He had a very good idea of what quality was, and I suppose what he saw was positive in what he was doing, but it must have been incredibly hard without the feedback from a market that you're on the right track, especially when you don't have much money to start with and you're putting it all into this idea that's incredibly hard year in, year out to do. That faith to stick with it, that must have been quite a defining part of the atmosphere in your upbringing.
One of the great advantages that I have is that no one expects us to do anything off the rack. I'm really allowed to innovate and to do kooky things because that's exactly what we started off as. And Dad had a very singular vision of wine. In a way, it might have been an advantage to the fact that there wasn't already a market here because there wasn't also an established taste or profile of Oregon wine. Dad could make the wine that he wanted to make, grow the grapes the way that he wanted to grow them, and then create this incredibly age-worthy Pinot Noir that would reflect those values. I think now, kind of looking back, I feel a little bit like winemakers are sort of forced into a box with the Pinot style. And we talk about the Oregon Pinot style, and I taste these wines, and there's a lot of consistency amongst them. The quality level is good, so that's definitely a bonus for the state. But also, I do miss a bit of what you would find when you would go to a tasting 30 years ago or 40 years ago, when there was so much diversity and so many ideas about how Pinot Noir should express itself here.
Yeah, it just feels funny from another era, I suppose, because today we think that you're being incredibly patient when you wait 3 to 5 years for affirmation and fame and feedback. And, sometimes it's praise, sometimes it's money that gives you that. But it's a very different thing in those old pioneer times. I think that idea of patience is just on a completely different scale. It's something that you really need in the wine industry even today. Speaking of affirmation and positive feedback, when did that start to arrive and in what guise, and how did that change the game?
It sort of arrived in trickles. Kind of looking back through the files, I found a letter that was sent from a wine club, just a group of people who got together to taste wine in New York in probably 1972 or 3. And they had solicited Dad for a bottle of Chardonnay to taste with wines from France. And they had sent him back a letter saying, hey, your wine did really well. Good job, bucko. And, I'm sure that was a really important early affirmation. It was important enough to, put it in a file folder, keep it forever. So those first affirmations were definitely coming from private consumers. It was so difficult to get the local newspaper, the Oregonian, to write about us. They sort of saw us, I guess, as a curiosity or something. Our first real notoriety came not until 1980, so 15 years after those grapes were planted. Back in 1975, my father had one of the later planted blocks, one of the blocks that was planted in 1968. In the early 70s, he started making the first wines from that block and realizing this is something really special, very different than the vines that grow immediately around it. And so for him, it was this big eureka moment of, oh, Oregon can do that amazing Burgundy trick of this real specificity of flavor because of this specificity of place. So that was his first reserve wine, and he made his first sort of commercial-sized batch in 1975. 50 cases or something, maybe even less, maybe 25. He called that the South Block Reserve. And his friend Becky Wasserman, who at that time was a barrel salesman, he gave her a few bottles, and she took them back to Burgundy, and unbeknownst to him, entered them in a competition in Paris in 1980, or 79, excuse me, that was run by the food magazine Gaumillot, and they called it the Olympiade de Vin, so the Olympics of wine. And there were about 680 different wines, and there were many different categories depending on the type of wine. And so in the Pinot Noir typology, the Eyre Vineyards 1975 South Block came in the top 10, along with scandalous several other American and New World wines, including one from Australia, I might point out. It was such a shocking result that the French took a closer look at the French wines that were involved, and they were wines from a department store in Paris called Nicolas. So it was sort of a private label, a white label wine sold through a department store. So obviously maybe not of the highest standards. So Robert Drouhin of Maison Joseph Drouhin repeated the tasting with the same wines and the same judges in Beaune. And this time, instead of using department store wines, he brought in wines from his own cellar from a range of years, from the last 15 to 20 years, to rematch against the top 10 wines in this finish. And in the second tasting, the Eyrie Vineyards wine, the 75 South Block, came within 0.2 of a point of first place. And that's when the press finally started to notice us. And that's when, the New York Times wrote about us. And once the New York Times wrote about us, the Oregonian thought maybe we were good enough for publication. And so they started writing about us too. And then in 1983, there was another sort of series of tastings again in New York, of another wine group. And they tasted the 83 vintage from, the producers in Oregon at the time. And at that time, there were, 5 or 6 good ones, with, again, Burgundy and Oregon showed really well yet again. So this was, the early 80s were this time of recognition, not just for Eyrie, but for Oregon in general, as people were beginning to sort of place these wines alongside Burgundy.
Yes, and you've mentioned before that as much as the headlines are important, the headlines go away. Even if you were new news for the Oregonian 15 years later, as they say, today's news, tomorrow's chip wrappers. But what did last, I gather, was how the Burgundians came to take very seriously Willamette as a terroir for growing great Pinot Noir.
Indeed, the best result of that tasting, especially the follow-up tasting, was that Burgundians are by nature actually kind of an insular culture, but a curious one. And in the early 80s, we started getting visits from people like the Lafarges and the Potels and the Drouhins. La Lubise Leroy came and visited us. It was a really kind of magical time, because for us, it was also a great opportunity to learn. So there was this immediate sort of frisson between the two cultures, and realizing that we were sort of doing something very similar. Burgundy is dominated by small family-run domains where the grapes are grown and the wines are made by the hands of the members of the family. And it was very much the same ethos here. So there was immediately sort of this connection there from that. These cultural ties led to us establishing the International Pinot Noir celebration here locally in McMinnville, Oregon. Back in 1987 was the first one. Really to bring the community of Pinot growers together. We were all sort of toiling in isolation, New Zealand, Australia, Burgundy, maybe not so much, but it was a great way to bring this community of Pinot lovers together and exchange information, and also to illuminate consumers, because it was a consumer event, about the beauty and diversity of Pinot Noir. So that really cemented this international brotherhood and sisterhood that we'd established. We're very fortunate in that first IPNC, International Pinot Noir Celebration, that our keynote speaker was Robert Drouhin. And Robert came, and while he was here and while he was speaking, he was also sort of looking around for a piece of land. And I was actually interning with the Drouhin family in France the first year of the IPNC. And so when Robert came back from his trip to Oregon, he said, "Jason, I have good news for you. We are going to be neighbors." And he was not wrong. That was a very good piece of news.
Excellent. Well, one thing that can come up with Pinot Noir is a certain sense of putting Burgundy on a pedestal and perhaps falling into the trap of trying to mimic, to imitate, as opposed to using that model and applying lessons a little bit more laterally to one's work. How do you regard the experience and advice that you've taken from Burgundy and applied it to where you are?
And that is a very clever differentiation. Instead of looking at it as sort of a point of status, like what do we take away? I think what we took away from Burgundy as a whole was that the amount of technology that you apply to the process of making wine does not necessarily result in great wine. What results in great wine is great care, and especially back in the vineyard. So that's kind of what has been the basis and foundation of how we grow Pinot Noir here. The other thing that really makes great wine, regardless of variety, is intention. I always feel when you taste a wine, I developed this theory in Burgundy because I would go and I would visit producers and get really excited about their wines and just enthralled by what they were doing and ask them technical questions. And, these people were actually quite forthcoming, and they would explain, well, like how long I leave it in the tank and what size my tanks are and what racking looks like. And so I, carefully writing down all these notes for how to make the great Pinot Noir. And then I would go to another producer the next day and be equally enthralled by those wines and think that they were every bit as sensitive and capable of expression as the ones of the day before, and ask them questions about technique. Of course, it's completely different. So what did those two producers have in common? It was very little to do with the technique and much more to do with intention. So this is a little bit mystical, but I think that grapes understand the intention of the people that grow them, and that technique is maybe a little bit less important.
Okay, so you were obviously spending a lot of time, as you say, left to your own devices, but never far from the example of your mother and father and what they were up to in the vines. But it wasn't entirely what you imagined yourself doing. Could you just explain with the timeline what your thoughts were about your place at Eyrie or somewhere else in the world as your own person, and how that came back around?
Well, I'm very lucky with the upbringing that I had. My parents were quite poor during those years. I never had a pair of pants on my own. I always had to wear my brother's hand-me-downs. I'm sorry, I should say trousers. Pants we did not share. But at the same time, we had this incredibly sort of enriching environment because friends of my parents from all around the world would come and visit us and stay in the little house behind ours and have dinner with us. And I got to grow up just hearing a lot of different accents spoken. So I knew we were doing something important here. I just wasn't quite sure why. My best friend when I was growing up lived on an apple farm, and they had a beautiful sort of creek and woods and everything. And I always wanted to go down and play with him because that environment, that ecological diversity was so interesting. When you grow up on a vineyard, it's these regimented ranks of vines, which are very sort of impressive as a view, but as a kid, wanting to build a tree house, maybe not so interesting. I'm going to circle back to that later. But what did happen was, I would have to make pocket money. And especially when I decided that I wanted to go to Burgundy, the deal was that I had to make the money to do that myself. So I worked in the vineyard, and I got to know all these vines really well on a vine-by-vine basis. And it's funny, my daughter talks to me. She's had some of the same experiences I did growing up. And she says she feels like the vines are siblings. And I totally get that. That's how they feel to me as well. So it's not just a crop and a farmer. It's a bit more of a familial relationship. But that said, definitely winemaking and Eyrie Vineyards was so associated with my father. And he had, as I do when I work, very fixed ideas about how things are to be done. Everything that my dad did was amazingly cool up until the time I was 13. And then after I turned 13, everything that my father did was amazingly annoying. This is a widespread problem, I think. So I had to find my way back on my own terms. So when I was 18, I moved away. I lived in the desert, like I said, which I still love the desert. I wound up moving to New Mexico and working there, and then finally eased my way into college at the, hoary age of 24 and got a degree in plant ecology. And I think that kind of went back to those early experiences with my friends, running around in the forest and climbing trees. What I didn't realize sort of going in was how applicable this was going to be to grape growing. Because when you look at these fields of grapes, you have to realize that there is a very diverse ecology there, but it's all underground. And that's really magical what's going on down there. And something that I didn't really grasp the extent of until I had the opportunity to study it formally.
So you came back in 1997, helped out your father quite a bit, and decided that you really liked doing a lot of the work involved but then were given the advice to go and travel. How did the travel and the idea of coming back then take shape, and what was the handover like eventually?
So I came back in 97 just on a temporary basis, just to help with harvest, sort of the way that my daughter does for me now, to show up and, help tally the buckets of grapes and get everything to the winery on time and make sure that we're picking things in the right order and that sort of stuff. Back and forth communication with the winery, which in those days was hard because we didn't have cell phones. So it's just Javier trucking the grapes back and forth and bringing written messages with him. And I wasn't exactly sure that was what I wanted to do, but then I started exploring PhD programs and realizing that wasn't what I wanted to do. And also just really feeling like there were parts of wine growing that were enormously satisfying. It's not just the making wine and the growing grapes. It's the keeping the equipment running. I love mechanical things. It's the entire sort of puzzle of putting together this logistical sort of three-dimensional chess game involved with getting wine from the grape to the bottle. It's the design, it's the writing and the talking about wine. It's the cultural traditions. It's the fact that you have to innovate. It's kind of going back to my childhood of being archaeologist, writer, or inventor. Like, I get to do all those things. And I couldn't see any other profession that would give me that opportunity. I suppose the way I was raised kind of ruined me for any other respectable job. So I wound up winemaking and grape growing. So I was ready to sort of jump back into the family business with both feet. And I told Dad that I was, ready to go off to graduate school and learn winemaking. And he said, "Oh, what a waste of time." He said, "You're going to go to graduate school and they're going to teach you how to filter wine through a specific kind of plastic bead, and you're going to write a paper on that, but you're going to graduate and you won't have any greater understanding of how to make wine than you have right now. You might have a greater understanding of how not to make wine. Why don't you travel instead?" So we took a small fraction of the money that it would have cost to go to graduate school and dedicated it to traveling instead. And my partner and I worked in New Zealand. And then we also had the opportunity to sort of repeat what my dad did and to travel throughout Europe, not for 8 months, unfortunately, a few weeks. But we had the advantage of these amazing letters of introduction from my father. And so we really got a chance to dig deep in Burgundy and also see a bit of Switzerland and Germany as well, and even do some work with members of the trade in London and understand a bit maybe of the sales culture of wine, because England really is still very much the heart of that. So that was a really great sort of rounding process. And then I came back to the winery full of ideas and ready to try new things. Shot down every time. I remember we had a knockdown, drag-out fight over whether we would paint the stairs up to the crusher deck with skid-resistant paint or whether we would use adhesive skid strips. We didn't talk to each other for 3 days after that argument. So it was a situation where we agreed on all of the big stuff. There was no question that we wanted to make wines that aged and were expressive and grown without herbicides. All of that stuff was no question. It's the little things, the little details, the things that winemakers obsess over that we would fight about. And I think eventually he looked at me and said, "Jason, you can get another job, but I can't." And I'm really glad he said that, because it meant that we could still have, Thanksgiving dinner together and spend holidays together as a family and not spend all of our time talking about work. So I went off and got back into research. I worked with the small fruits breeding program at Oregon State University. I also did a stint of woodworking and improved those skills. But I found my way back to vineyard management, managing another vineyard. And then I also found my way back to winemaking and started a small label. And I think when my father saw me growing grapes and making wine on my own recognizance, not because it was something that, I felt like I had to do, but because it was something that I wanted to do, I think he felt more confident about inviting me back to the domain.
And so 2005 is the year, I'm sure it was a bit more transitional, but also I'm sure that there were some fairly, serious things to nut out about the future of Eyrie. But 2005, I feel, is the start of the Jason Lett era. Fantastic progress since then in many ways. I think it's about time we actually talked about the estate itself. Tell us a little bit about the 5 vineyards that you have and where they entered the picture?
One of the things that felt like a disadvantage starting out to my parents, I think, was the fact that they didn't have any money and they couldn't buy one big farm and plant it out, that they had to work really small and incrementally. So the reason that we have 5 vineyards is not because we wanted 5 vineyards, but because that's what we had to have. It's turned into a big advantage because it gives us such a range. All of the vineyards are located within about a kilometer or less from each other in a little strand up the Dundee Hills, starting at about 80 meters of elevation and capping out at about 280. And that window there, that 200 meters of elevation, is really the sweet spot for these period 1 varieties to ripen successfully. So the first vineyard is right about in the middle of the strand, and that's the Eyrie. The Eyrie is our founding vineyard. That's where those 1965 grapes were planted, and I'm still able to make wine from those vines today. And so that's sort of the historical and aesthetic heart of the estate. Moving out from that, then the next vineyard that we planted was actually at the very top of the hill. When we talk about marginal sites, a very marginal site in those days. And so we planted varieties up there that would ripen in a cooler climate. So Pinot Gris is the principal variety up there, but also Pinot Meunier, because it is so cool. Dad thought maybe we could, play around with some bubbles. And then previously there was some Pinot Noir planted there. So we continue to make all 3 of those varieties from Daphne. The next 2 vineyards, Roland Green at, about 200 meters of elevation, and Sisters, which is our lowest vineyard at that 80-meter level. Those 2 were both purchased in the late 1980s and early 1990s and planted. And then finally in 2011, our 5th vineyard adjoins the Eyrie, and it's called the Outcrop, and that's actually where I'm talking from now. 2 vineyards that are principally Pinot Noir, and then the other vineyards are blends of the other sort of period 1 varieties that we're growing. I've sort of branched out, like I say, we went down from our 7 original varieties to 5. And Dad retained Pinot Meunier because he wasn't quite sure that the Willamette Valley was going to be warm enough to ripen Pinot Noir. So if we had to make sparkling wine, he wanted to have the 3 most important varieties available. But I love Pinot Meunier, so I planted more, and I've also brought 2 more varieties into the portfolio, Trousseau and also Chasselas, which is a Swiss white variety, and have planted those here. And, I think the potential for the Willamette Valley to grow things besides Pinot Noir and Chardonnay is still very great, and we may not have done all the work to understand that potential.
We've spoken about Pinot quite a bit, obviously, because it's such an important foundational point for Eyrie. There's a lot of things we always say about Pinot Noir, but I just wondered if you could put in a nutshell what your understanding of your mission is with Pinot Noir and how you go about it.
Kind of going back to the theme of these arguments that I would have with my dad being over little things, not big things. One of sort of Dad's founding stylistic, for lack of a better words, aesthetic foundations was that you should never taste the ego of the winemaker, right? Once you can taste the ego, you might have ruined the wine. It is, unfortunately, a real truism in wine. You hear it all the time. Oh, I just want to express the sight. That truly is the intention. Every year, sometimes I succeed, and sometimes I think maybe I could have done better expressing the sight. Not because there's some winemaking thing that I could have imposed that would have done it better, but really just made a better decision about, when to pick. I might have picked that 2 days too early or 2 days too late. I think there's 2 schools to winemaking. There's the Vichyssoise school, the soup that takes 3 days to make, an enormous amount of skill and processing and, super accurate measurements of everything to make this perfectly clear broth and this very delicate soup. Or there's the sashimi school, where you just take a really beautiful raw ingredient and then present it beautifully and minimally. And in that spectrum, definitely I'm more on the side of being the sashimi chef than the Vichyssoise.
I know we're not supposed to use analogies, Jason, because they don't express the truth, but I really like that one. Moving on to some other grape varieties. We shouldn't ignore Pinot Gris because, as you say, it's a very important grape for Oregon. You mentioned earlier how important intent was, and I've heard you say before that intent makes good wine, cynicism makes bad wine. Pinot Gris has become quite a popular vehicle for delivering crisp, relatively neutral white wines in a Grigio style, or maybe something a bit less interesting than Chardonnay, but with a bit more body than Pinot Grigio style in some markets. What is it about this grape that excites you, and how do you see its charm and your duty to bring that out?
Pinot Gris certainly is the under-recognized sibling in the family, sort of the middle child, has all the same genetics as Pinot Noir. It has the same capability of expressing nuances of site and of vintage and soil. And if you make it like Pinot Noir, if you put that same amount of attention into it, and especially if you're thoughtful about how much yields you allow to hang, you wind up with a wine that gives you that expressiveness. Unfortunately, Pinot Gris has become a bit of a victim of its own success. And in fact, we could probably go off on a whole tangent about varietal labeling and whether that's a good idea or not. But, people say, oh, I want a Pinot Gris. And therefore, they already have a fixed idea about what those characters are going to be. And some of those are imposed by the winemaker, a certain amount of residual sugar left in the wine and a certain degree of crispness, like you say. But, Pinot Gris, like Pinot Noir, has this broad range of expressivity. My approach with Pinot Gris is definitely sort of to treat it like Pinot Noir, both in the vineyard in terms of the yields that we ask from the vines, the attention that we give to the vines, the same kinds of sort of rigorous canopy management that we offer to the Pinot Noir also gets extended to the Pinot Gris. And then when we pick those grapes and bring them into the winery, rather than fermenting them on the skins, we're fermenting them in a stainless tank. Because with that wine, I just feel like it's really important that the variety be able to sing, that there's not that influence of wood, that you can taste exactly the variety. Where we differ from a lot of other Pinot Gris that's made is that we just leave it on the lees for a very long time. Our Pinot Gris is on the lees for almost a full year. I think most of the, Pinot Gris that people associate with hanging around by the swimming pool, probably in the bottle 2 to 3 months after it's been picked. Really just giving it that extra time and the time on the lees and the time for, when Pinot Gris is fermenting, it smells so amazing. You're walking through the winery and suddenly you smell peach or you smell lemon blossom. There's just this incredible sort of bouquet of aromas coming out of the tanks at any given time. A lot of those really intense characters get locked up in the yeast and fall to the bottom. So for the first 2 or 3 months, if I'm tasting Pinot Gris right now, it's so bland. A lot of the aromatic character is still locked up in the lees underneath. So after the lees autolyze a little bit and give those aromas back, that's when the wine's ready to bottle. So that's why we wait about 12 months, because it takes that time for the fruit and all of those amazing secondary and tertiary characters to return back into the wine again.
Very good. Well, I think it's probably for that very reason that I only have one producer's Pinot Gris in my wine fridge, and that is yours.
Oh, thank you.
Now, other grape varieties, you mentioned Chasselas, Meunier, Trousseau. Meunier has always been very dear to your heart. You've said from when you were young, picking birthday bottles out of the cellar. What is it about that grape?
I think one of the things that I love about Meunier is that it's a bit of an underdog. In Champagne, Meunier is put down a little bit. I think what's really fascinating about Meunier, especially now, is that it seems to have an incredible tolerance for the sort of climate vicissitudes that we're being exposed to now. Meunier is named that because there's a white fuzz on the leaves that looks like flour. Meunier is the French word for miller, someone who grinds wheat. And so, millers are always covered with dust. And so the vines look like that too. But early in the spring, those hairs sort of fluff up and protect the buds from frost. And then later in the year, and our summers here in Oregon tend to be quite dry and warm. Those hairs reflect a lot of that extra light and keep the microclimate around the cluster a bit cooler. Like a desert plant, you often see they have fuzz on the leaves. And in very challenging vintages, I've made really, really lovely Pinot Meunier. And I'm just intrigued by its resilience in that way. And finally, it's versatile. Tomorrow we're going en tirage with a wine that's made from about 40% Pinot Meunier and 60% Pinot Noir. But I love the Pinot Meunier component to that wine. Even though sparkling wines have a much different range of expression than still wines, the Pinot Meunier is still bringing in this sort of earthiness and vivacity that really complements the Pinot Noir really well. I'm in love with Pinot Meunier from a variety of points of view.
Yeah, and Chasselas is relatively expressive, I suppose, of your desire to keep being probed by wine as much as anything else, because it's taught you something quite important about what you know and what you don't know.
Chasselas, we had one vine that had gotten sort of accidentally mixed in with our Muscat when we got our vines from the University of California, Davis, the cuttings back in 1965. And we had a Swiss researcher and friend, Werner Koblet, walking through the vineyard, and we're walking through the Muscat, and his head just swivels, and he says, "Oh, Chasselas." So this vine has this very distinctive coppery-colored cane. And so we thought, oh, that's what that is. And so we started taking cuttings from it and planting it just as a table grape because it's really delicious. And then we got the urge to make wine out of it. And my first few vintages of Chasselas were terrible. They tasted like salad oil. There was really sort of oily texture, no acidity at all, really no fruit, nothing exciting about it at all. Finally, in 2013, I said, I'm going to tear this all out next year. We'll leave one vine for eating and all the rest can come out. And this final year, I'm just going to pick it really green and maybe use it as an acid component to blend into the Pinot Gris. It did not wind up getting blended into the Pinot Gris because it was so absolutely exciting. By picking it at levels far below where I would pick any other varietal wine, we get the stoniness and we get a little bit of that broad texture still, but really complemented by beautiful fruit and great aromatics. And the thing that I love the most about Chasselas is its subtlety. Like, it is a terroir wine around Lake Geneva in the area where it's grown, not because it's brash, but because of its subtlety, it's really able to show those differences from site to site because the variety itself isn't standing on a soapbox shouting.
Chardonnay gets probably more airplay than most other grapes on this podcast, partly because we're in Australia where it's having a real moment in a lot of different regions. It would be probably taken for granted from an Australian viewpoint that where you're growing Pinot Noir, you're growing Chardonnay. Now, you are growing Chardonnay, you're growing it very well, but it's not as simple as that in the Willamette Valley, I gather, to get this wine right. Some people have given up on the idea and moved to something else. So again, why is it so hard?
The Chardonnay is hard because it's malleable. Pinot Noir is not malleable. If you try to, bend Pinot Noir to be a wine that it doesn't want to be, it fights back and makes something that is not very pleasant. Chardonnay, on the other hand, accepts intervention. And so there's a big stylistic range of Chardonnay, and I'm sure you see this in Australia, a stylistic range that's not necessarily driven by the vineyard. So I think that one of the reasons that Chardonnay's had such variable success in the Willamette Valley is because of this temptation to bend it. Don't know if you're familiar with the American critic Robert Parker, who was very influential in determining wine styles through the 90s and even into the early 2000s, and was actually one of the early supporters of what we were doing in Oregon. But I found it interesting that in the late 80s, he was calling us out for using too much new oak in our Chardonnay. Robert Parker is not shy at all about wines with new oak. So when Robert Parker calls you out for having too much new oak, you're probably using too much new oak. But we were trying for this sort of rich Meursault style of Chardonnay, which we couldn't really pull off at that time, not with the climate that we had. Or the other sort of error that we would make would be to try to make this into a cash flow wine and to be a little bit cynical about it and to, elevate the yields a little bit. And we would wind up with these wines that couldn't ripen and that were, screechingly acidic and not very pleasant to drink. So then you got my dad just kind of plugging along, keeping those yields modest, keeping the oak down, making these wines that, nobody expects a 10-year-old New World Chardonnay to age, but I can go back into the cellar and pull corks on 30 and 40-year-old bottles, and they're fantastic. And it's just really, kind of goes back to that intentionality and getting the ego out of the way and not being cynical about, sort of your yields and being thoughtful about the vines that you're making your wines from.
Well, speaking of vines, then, you bring to Eyrie, a place that has always been very conscious of what it is and isn't doing with inputs or the lack of them, an even greater sense of that. So could you just give a sense of what your great love of ecosystems and ecology have brought to your awareness of those vines, how they behave, what they need from you?
When I came back from the University of New Mexico full of ideas about agronomy, one of the first things I noticed was how much my father was doing right. He really stopped plowing between the rows. Once the vines were established, 4 or 5 years after planting, once the root systems had gone down far enough and they could, access water and didn't have to worry about competition from the plants on the ground, he would stop plowing and just move specifically to mowing. So when I came and started, looking around and doing little plant surveys and stuff, I was finding enormous genetic diversity amongst the plants that were growing around the vines. There's this concept of mycorrhiza, which are, these microbial, fungal, actually, companions to photosynthesizing plants that we didn't even know about until 1980. And I still continue to be somewhat astonished that Dad seemed to intuit the importance of having very stable soils, not turning the soils over, not disrupting those mycorrhizal communities. That's not to say that it was perfect, from my point of view. And one of those things that we kind of, rubbed heads over was whether we should continue to till underneath the vines. So I stopped all tillage underneath the vines, all tillage of any kind, except in newly planted vineyards. I stopped all tillage back the first year I came, back in 2005. Part of that was because I wanted to expand this tradition of no-till farming that my father had long established. And another part was that we had phylloxera come into our vineyards, and our vineyards are on their own roots. We're not, unfortunately, on grafted stock, which means that we're susceptible to phylloxera. And in order to keep, making wine from these old vines for as long as possible is important to me, not to spread the little critters around. So I'm happy to say 20 years later, even though we have lost a few acres of grapes to phylloxera, we haven't lost the whole farm, and I am still able to make wine from those old vines. A lot of what, Dad and I have done throughout our careers is being validated by science. There's so many really interesting techniques now for looking at genetic diversity in soils. A few years ago, I was really happy to have been contacted by a researcher down at the University of Oregon who wanted to look at the microbial diversity. And it was really interesting results because she looked both what the microbes were doing underneath the vines, but also between the vines in the alley between the vines. And it turns out that the microbial communities growing directly under the vines are very different than what's in the alley. So the vines themselves are making choices about what organisms they want to combine forces with, collaborate with, support, because a lot of the sugars that they're making are getting pumped straight into the ground. It's really interesting work. And also what's interesting is to look at the fungal communities that are growing. In our original vineyard, the Eyrie, there are organisms that were previously only reported in old growth forests that are growing underneath those vines. So just by giving it the mere 60 years for those soils to recover, we're seeing much more complicated and profound fungal networks occurring around the vines.
Yeah, and I believe this is a relatively underdeveloped area of research, but the role of fungus and bacteria in breaking down minerals and then how those are taken up by vines is a pretty exciting area of research, and perhaps could open a bit of a window on understanding what we term minerality in wine. Too much of a stretch?
No, that's a contentious thing. I feel like minerality was a term that was invented by marketing organizations. Yeah. Because the Burgundians have had to learn that people can take Pinot Noir and plant it in other places, and people can even take our people. And, there's plenty of Burgundian winemakers in Oregon. So even the winemaking knowledge and culture can move. But what cannot move is the soil. And so if you want to talk about the thing in your region that is something that can never move anywhere else, then you talk about the soil. And the soil is always predicated on what the parent material is. So, if you're in Beaujolais, you're going to talk about granite, and, in Chablis, you're going to talk about limestone and the particular types of limestone. However, the parent material isn't actually what the vine is touching. The vine is touching this deeply mediated soil that is derived from those. And the greatest and last piece of that mediation isn't the chemical breakdown of the particles into something soluble that the vine can absorb. It's actually these funguses breaking down that last step of the physical degradation of the parent material into soil particles and turning it into mineral that the vine can access. So it's so funny when you go to regions that have these renowned soils and this renowned minerality, and you're looking at vineyards that are just absolutely desertified, where not a plant can grow because of decades, sometimes generations of plowing and herbicides. I do think there's a missing piece to the minerality that they're able to access, just because there's not that life in the top, 30 centimeters, 50 centimeters of soil that is providing those mineral components directly to the vines. And that's why I think that some of the movements that are happening in these established regions where people are moving away from tillage and people are thinking much more about these microbial communities, so important, and really creating really exciting wines again.
Well, you said you had imposter syndrome over being a winemaker, but you're also a farmer, a maintenance man for your winery, a leader of a team, and you've got to deal with the business of selling and marketing wine as well. How do you feel about that whole puzzle. I mean, there's a couple of ways to go around, I think, some of those roles. One is to know that you love one of them, which I guess for you would be the plants and the farming side of things, and to do the rest because you have to. But is there a part of doing the farming where you can add those other responsibilities back into the satisfaction of what your craft is and why you bother?
I think one of the things that I love about the job is that it requires so many different skills. I think I addressed this before. So I do find satisfaction. There are parts of it that I do sort of feel I'm more naturally good at than others. I feel like I'm a little bit of an introvert. And then on the other hand, people that know me well are like, no, you're very good at talking. Don't worry about it. So, I'm about to embark on a couple of weeks, about a month of market work, traveling around, selling wine, talking to people, hundreds of people, and pouring wine. And I come back from those trips actually feeling really recharged and energized by the people that I've met. So even though I'd like to kind of pose myself as a curmudgeon who likes to stomp around my vineyard and ignore the world, that's really not true. I find great sources of renewal in almost every piece of the business, except for filling out federal paperwork.
That's fair enough. You talked about how important it was to remove the ego from wine, but of course it's not a one-man job. Tell us a little bit about who works on the farm and helps you out with what you do.
100%. That is such a great question because of my name and the position. People think that I do it all myself, and I do almost nothing. Each vine in the vineyard is visited 15 times by hand, and then another 15 times with a tractor. And then when they come into the winery, each one of those 280 barrels has to be topped up every 10 days. I'm not doing that work. So I'm really lucky to have two families working with us, Mexican-American families, the Garcias and the Ponces, along with Julio Hernandez, who's also a Ponce. And they've been with us for decades. And so I think when we talk about the Eyre Vineyards being like the Lett family, that's not true at all. It's the Letts, the Garcias and the Ponces and the Hernandezes that make this wine. And where I'm especially blessed with this crew is because people think that labor is unskilled. Unskilled labor are two words that go together far too often. And, to make great wine requires an enormous level of skill and dedication. And I think a lot of people look at vineyard work as something that is demeaning. And I'm really lucky that I have a group of people that don't look at it as demeaning. They look at it as challenging. They look at it as how can we do it a little bit better next year? And, have the toughness and fortitude and intelligence to just keep pushing that envelope. So I could not be more grateful to this group of people I work with. The only downside is that we're all getting older. And I'm not quite sure how that transition happens, where we continue to keep this amazing sort of brain trust of how to grow and make wine active through more generations. So that's a whole other podcast for us to embark on there, Ed.
We've obviously spoken a lot about your father because he is so integral to the name of Eyrie, the reputation and the journey it's been on. But at the same time, women have been an important part of this as well. You've mentioned before a story that I loved about I think it was your grandmother and her sisters in their jazz band, which seemed a little bit of a quirky and contrarian thing itself. But obviously Becky Wasserman, who you mentioned as a really important figure. What other roles have women played in the establishment of Eyrie?
Well, like I said, my father's best decision when he moved to Oregon wasn't planting grapes. It was marrying my mother. She was instrumental in, working side by side with him on the labor side. And then there was also so much to do on the business side. And because my mom was raising my brother and I, two little rambunctious kids, kind of kept her closer to the house. And so that was a big piece of what she did, just be instrumental in being the face of the business. And, definitely very much behind that early work of talking about Oregon Pinot Noir and why what we were doing was important. There's an iconic picture of the early wine growers taken in, I think, 1983. And my mom tells this story. I've always seen this picture. It's, a rank of bearded guys standing around a table loaded with food and bottles of wine, and they're toasting the camera. And I heard my mom tell this story about this, that all the partners of these men were dressed up and ready to have their pictures taken too. And the photographer said, oh, no, just the winemakers. Okay, what an incredible opportunity lost, because those women were so important to the foundation of the industry. And I'm glad to say that in the pictures we've taken of the industry since, you see a lot more women's faces. And I think now, probably if you look at the winemaking talent in the valley, it's probably majority women. I'm glad to see that we've progressed on that score and that women are starting to get their due. But of course, we do have a long way to go.
You mentioned that observing what was happening when you were younger, the people who were involved and paying attention to the work that your parents were doing gave you the sense that it was important. And you just said a similar thing just now. Wine's obviously not having an easy time of it at the moment, and really culture's not having a particularly easy time of it either, and nor is a sense of comfort or well-being in the world. How does wine fit with your idea of what's valuable in the world and what it can bring to people, what it's brought to you?
What an interesting question. I had a friend, a daughter of an important name in Oregon winemaking, who came to me for advice 10 years ago because she was being invited back to the family domain to sort of take over from her father and to be that voice and face of the winery. But she's an accomplished artist in her own right and wasn't sure that she wanted to take that on. And I told her that one of the beautiful things about owning a business in the United States of America is that it gives you the status and the ability to change people's lives, to shelter people, to build a team, to be a bulwark against the kinds of cultural movements like the one that we're seeing right now. It's so incredibly upsetting. And I still feel that. But that's as a business owner in general. When it comes to wine in particular, what's important about that? I feel that wine is the last bastion of understanding our food. That for hundreds of thousands of years, we have understood the importance of sight and flavor, mediated through everything that we ate and drank. But that as our food chains become more corporatized and commodified, that link is broken. Wheat is wheat, flour is flour. The last bastion where people care about where something comes from is wine. So it's such an incredible sort of gift to be able to talk about this and to be one of the last farmers on earth who gets to. That's just amazing.
Well, that's almost it for this week's podcast, but the morning after this chat, I awoke to a message from Jason. He'd risen at the crack of dawn in Oregon to bottle that sparkling Pinot Noir Meunier blend he'd mentioned. He'd called to get something off his conscience.
I didn't really sleep that well last night, and one of the reasons is because I don't feel like I answered your question about selling wine and how that felt very well. Because I'm extremely lucky. I'm actually not the person who's out there on the streets every day selling the wine. That's actually Russ Margach and Amy McCandlish are the two people who are the voice and the face of Eyrie outside of the winery. Most of the time. I get trotted out, from time to time, and I'm happy to help. But really, day in, day out, Russ and Amy are the people who are answering the emails and following up on the follow-ups and, making people out there in the trade feel like they're have someone to talk to, somebody, knowledgeable and competent and calm and enthusiastic. So when I was talking about the members of the team, I really feel remiss that I didn't mention Russ and Amy. And, inside the winery, we have a very small tasting room, but that's Erin and Cesar, and they are fantastic personalities as well. And then I also couldn't not mention Monica, who really makes sure that the whole sort of back end of getting the wine out the door happens smoothly and well, and then we're tracking everything perfectly. It's, again, wine is labor in a bottle, but not all that labor is working in the vineyard. I definitely put the vineyard people and the winery folks on a pedestal because they're from communities that don't get the recognition and the kudos and the appreciation that they deserve. And so I'd like to give them that, acknowledgement and those kudos and my extreme gratitude now. And with that, I'm going to go off and bottle. But thank you very much again. It was a real pleasure recording the show with you yesterday. And I appreciate the opportunity to chime in again. Thank you.
And that really is it for this week's podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, please like, subscribe, and share with everyone. A rating on Apple, Spotify, wherever makes a huge difference. And please subscribe to my Substack. Free or paid, it all counts. Buy me at edmerison.substack.com. Leave a comment. What do you think? But for now, I'd like to say thank you to Lucas James for the music, Neil Williams for the artwork, Patricio Garcia for additional editing, and to my guest, Jason Lett. Till next time, live wine to the fullest. Cheers.